Okay, we'll get going here. Firstly, my name is Matt Taylor. I'm the chair of the Services and Boundary Configuration Study for Area D in RDOS. Thanks very much for coming. This is the last of 5 events like this. Each one has had a similar agenda. It's just that we've taken examples from different communities within the area. So today, we're taking examples from the Okanagan Falls town site. Doesn't mean everybody here has to be from that part. Welcome if you're from Heritage Hills or Vassal Lake, welcome. But the examples we'll be using will be from Okanagan Falls. Also want to acknowledge that this meeting takes place on the traditional territory of the Silts people of the Okanagan Nation. Some housekeeping. Washrooms are straight out the back door. Under the sign it says washrooms. In the event of an emergency, we all go out the front door here, the same way you all came in. Questions? We want questions, so please feel free to ask them. The consultants will stop and take breaks and invite questions. When we have that, would you please stand and go to the mic? We have other people who are online, and they just can't hear you if you're not speaking into the mic. Lastly, masks definitely required unless you're speaking. And then we actually ask that you do take them off. Just again, it's much easier for everyone to understand what you're saying, and your voice will project a lot better if you take the mask off. So, to the meat of it, the purpose of our meeting, threefold. Firstly, we want to discuss and we want to hear from you on services that you get within the area, within your community, and the level of service provided within that service description. Secondly, we want you to talk to us about how decisions are made and your level of satisfaction with how decisions are made regarding the delivery of those services, so the decision-making process, and specifically, if you want more representation and more involvement or control in those decisions, as might be achieved through inclusion in an incorporated municipality with a duly elected mayor and council. So that's the option that we're talking about, the alternative if you want more representation. And thirdly, to consider, again, if an incorporation were to exist, where would you see the boundary being? Because this is just step 1 or 2 of a multi-step larger process. And there's a number of off-ramps along the way. So just because we've started it doesn't mean we have to go through to the final point. But if we were to go to the next step, that's an analysis, and that's a cost-benefit study of a particular area. So that's the task now. Figure out what is the area. Is it just Okanagan Falls town site? Is it Okanagan town site plus Vassal Lake? Or Okanagan Falls all the way up to Heritage Hills? Those are the options we need to think of in this study, so that in a subsequent study, a neutral third party can do a real fact-finding exercise on what are the pros and cons and the costs and the benefits of incorporating that area. Origins, how did we get here? This study was requested by the Okanagan Falls Community Association, writing a letter to RDOS. Our director, Ron Oberek, picked up on that and made the motion, and it was supported by the board of directors at RDOS. RDOS, in turn, has to make the recommendation to the Minister of Municipal Affairs. And it's she who approved this study and has paid a significant portion of the funding for this study. So that's how we got here. A committee was then formed, and our job is to provide neutral oversight for the project as a whole. We were appointed with consideration for representation from all the different communities within Area D. So there's some of us from Vassal Lake, some from Heritage Hills, Skaha Estates, etc. Tonight, we have several representatives from the committee. We have Eleanor Walker sitting at the back there. We have Bob Daly, who's our vice chair. Haven't seen if we have anyone else. Anyone else on the committee? Stick up your hand. No? Online, we have at least one representative, Kay Medlin, and in total there are 10. Consultants were contracted. We had a short list of a couple of organizations. Ultimately, the contract was awarded to Nielsen Strategies out of Kelowna, Alan Nielsen. He's assisted by Sherry Hurst, Left Side Partners out of Victoria. Some of you may recall Sherry worked on the governance study, which was completed, mind blank, 2017, which led to the splitting of the area into Area D, up the east side of Okanagan, Skaha Lake, and Area I up the west side. Ex officio members of our committee include both the Area D director, Ron Oberek, plus our alternate director, Jim D'Andrea. We also have staff support from RDOS. That's Christy Malden, who's the Deputy Corporate Officer, and David Van Omen from the BC Ministry of Municipal Affairs. So it's a well-resourced committee. This marks the first time since the late 80s when we've actually embarked on a process that could take us through to incorporation. In the late 80s, a similar process was initiated. We went through, or the community went through, to a referendum and voted no. Since then, there have been a number of studies. In fact, there's been a lot of studies in Okanagan Falls on one thing or another, but there has not been any study which was part of an incorporation process. So this is our, it's like 35 years later, subsequent kick at the can. And so here we are again, looking at step one of the decision. What's the area that we would incorporate? And then if we get to the next process, that's the cost benefit study. Plan for this afternoon, we're going to listen to our consultants, go through a presentation. As I said, they're going to stop. We're going to have Q&A. Again, I remind you, please go to the mic. Once they're complete, we're going to have comments from our Area D director. And those are from his perspective, okay? And then we have a broader discussion and Q&A. Questions might come to the committee, might go to the director, might go to the consultant. So, any quick questions before we get going here? Why are we here? This isn't current. Okay. Ellen, you're up. Sure.
That's okay. Thank you, Matt. Those are great opening remarks. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many people out this afternoon. We really appreciate the opportunity to come in and meet with so many of you in person. As you can appreciate the layout, or I'm just going to touch on how the rest of the meeting is going to go and give you an outline of that. It's a little bit different than what we would typically have in an open house because we are trying to accommodate people both in person as well as online. So we still try to recreate a lot of the learning, sharing, and dialogue opportunities that we would normally have in an open house, but again, at the same time, include those who are attending virtually. So the first point is, and I'm sure everyone, because Haley's been so excellent at making sure everyone gets a copy of these, but we do have handouts. So these are the type of things we would normally have on poster boards in an open house around the room. We will be referring to them during the presentation. For those of you who are online, if you didn't get your open house meeting package of the handouts, it is available on the RDOS Regional Connections website. So there is a link on there that you can click on that's to download the open house meeting package. And if you haven't already, you can do that during the meeting, or you can go there afterwards and take a look at them if you like. Alan and I will be doing a bit of a tag team presentation, so you're not stuck listening to one of us for too long, hopefully. And as Matt noted, we will be stopping at various points throughout the presentation, so you don't have to hold all your questions till the end. For those of you who are online, we will ask some questions of you in a polling format. So if you're attending online, and we've got an example one up there right now, just asking where you're from. So you will get a little poll that pops up. You can answer that. Just click on the answer that if you want to share, and then it will tally those answers at the end. And for those of you in person, we do have the back page on the handout, has some questions to consider. Those are things to just prompt some of your thoughts. You can share those when we do pause for questions. You don't have to. We will be asking some of you just to help get the conversation going during those times. But those questions are listed there in case you want to take a quick peek of them and have them in the back of your mind as we go through. Again, for those online, if you want to ask questions when we do pause for our questions, you can enter those questions into the chat function and they will be read out. Or you can use the raise your hand function online and we can unmute you and you can ask the question yourself. The other thing I'd like to mention, in addition to your handouts, you hopefully got in person a feedback form. We really encourage you to fill out that feedback form while you're here before you go out the door, and you can drop it off in the wire basket up here. We will be summarizing all that information for the committee, so all the feedback will be shared. And for those of you who are online, when the meeting is finished, you can press leave meeting, but if you leave your browser up, so don't close your Chrome or Explorer or whatever you're attending through, and the open house feedback form will pop up on your screen and you can fill it out online. If for some reason that doesn't work, you can always go to the RDOS Regional Connections website afterwards, and there is a link there to the feedback form as well. So I think that's all the things I wanted to touch on before we start. Does anyone have any questions before we kick off with our presentation? Perfect. Okay, sitting down. So just to give you an outline of our presentation, we'll be talking a little bit about background. So background about Area D, background about Okanagan Falls. We're going to talk to you about the services that you receive, governance, so how decisions are made on those services. We'll talk a little bit about boundary considerations. So when we're looking at creating a boundary for an incorporation study area, what kind of things do we use to figure out what that boundary entails? And we'll talk about incorporation impacts, things that we know would happen if the area was to be incorporated, as well as some next steps. So Matt touched on this already. What is the purpose of the study? So Matt mentioned, again, it's really just to start out by documenting the services that you do receive, how decisions are made on those services, to make sure everyone has the opportunity to understand how everything works before we start asking you questions on whether you want to see changes to that. And so we really spent the last 4 or 5 months doing just that. If you haven't been to the website to review all the materials that we've prepared, basically we have fact sheets for every single service that's received, and I believe it's 39 of them that you receive in Area D, including what they cost, how decisions are made on them, who's providing the service. So all that detail is available for people who want to go into that level of detail. And then this is the stage where, where we're meeting with residents like yourselves, and we're going around and trying to make sure that people have the opportunity to ask their questions. We want to hear from you on what service concerns you might have already, concerns you might have about representation, and just understand your perspective on what's going on in your community and how you feel about it. Then we're going to be looking at that information and compiling it together with some more technical analysis to consider what boundary configurations might make sense if the decision is made to move forward with an incorporation study. So coming up with that boundary is part of the purpose of the study. And lastly, to make sure there's sufficient understanding of what this means and residents' concerns and issues to determine if there is enthusiasm for proceeding with this type of study. And that'll be a decision that ultimately the committee makes a recommendation to the RDOS board, but that's what this committee is charged at looking at. A, what would the boundary be if we do move forward to an incorporation study? And B, is there enough interest in moving forward to that next step? So this is one of your handouts, and I just want to make sure, and Matt has mentioned this already, but so this is kind of the whole entire incorporation process. So if there was to be an incorporation, we really are at this end of this process. There's many stages along the ways, and it takes quite a bit of time, but we're at the point where we're just looking at, again, what are those concerns? What goes into creating a boundary that would make sense if we were to go down the rest of the path? At the end of this study, again, if the committee recommended that, you know what, we don't actually think there's enough interest in this community in pursuing this issue, there could be the opportunity then to say, we recommend that we don't even bother. You know, we've come up with this boundary, but we don't think so. So there is sort of that off-ramp that Matt referred to at this early stage. If the committee then recommends, here's the boundary, and we think there is interest in proceeding, they would make that recommendation to the RDOS board. The RDOS board would make that recommendation to the province, and the province would fund an incorporation study. That incorporation study looks at a very detailed analysis. It would compare the options of the status quo, what you have now, what it costs now for those services, what services you receive, and then it would also look at what it would look like and what it would cost in an incorporation model. So it will provide all that detailed analysis. You would have community meetings. They would make sure that the community has the opportunity to understand what those impacts are so they can make decisions. At the end of that process, that committee that's overseeing that study would be making a recommendation. Yes, we think everyone has had the opportunity to learn about this. We think the community is interested in having a referendum on this issue, or no, we don't want to go any further. We don't even think the community would like to have a referendum on this issue. So again, there's another one of those off-ramps. If they do recommend a referendum, the province sets up the referendum, and then the community within that study boundary area would have the opportunity to vote yes or no. If more than 50% vote yes, then you would get to incorporation. So the point here is we are really early in the process where we're just trying to figure out really what's the interest level and what would that boundary be. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Alan.
Thanks very much, Sherry, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many people out, and as Sherry mentioned, it's great to see people in person as opposed to online. Matt talked a little bit about the study committee, and let me talk a little bit more about the committee. I'm going to start at a very high level with the Constitution of Canada. We go all the way back to the Constitution. In the Constitution, we have a section that talks about a division of powers, and it assigns certain powers to the federal government and certain powers to the provincial government. The provincial government's powers include the power over, the authority over, and responsibility for providing local services, the administration of local services, which really translates into local governments. So provinces across Canada, they have used that authority to create local government systems across Canada. And every system by province is slightly different, but they all have certain similarities. They all have municipalities, for example. Anyway, in other provinces, whether we're talking Ontario or Alberta or Nova Scotia, the changes that are made to that system of local government over time, those are changes that are made by the provincial government in a very top-down way. So we see recently in Ontario, for example, the provincial government decided, without consulting citizens in Toronto, that they were going to reduce the size of the municipal council. We see in other places that we put together different municipalities to create one bigger municipality. We take one area, we put it in a different spot. And those are all done in other places by through a top-down process, decisions made by the provincial government. British Columbia has taken a much different approach, and we've had this approach since 1975, irrespective of which party is in power. In British Columbia, the approach is to respond to the wishes of local electors, to residents who live in the different communities. So in British Columbia, it's a very bottom-up process driven by citizens, and to determine what type of government they want to have at the local level, what governance system they want to have in place, whether they want to stay unincorporated or be incorporated. Those decisions, ultimately, they have to be ratified by the provincial government, but they're decisions that are driven in British Columbia by citizens. And so so Matt talked earlier about the Okanagan Falls Community Association initiating this process through a petition, first to the Electoral Area Director, to the RDOS, and then to the province. Very much a bottom-up process. And then the province said, okay, great, there's some interest in perhaps looking at a different governance system for Okanagan Falls, for Area D. Let's sponsor a study. We'll pay for the consultants. We'll provide the support. You put together a citizens committee, though, to run this, because ultimately it's going to be the local citizens who will determine what type of governance system is in place here in Okanagan Falls and Area D. So when we looked then at this study committee, Matt noted it's a volunteer group. It's representative of Area D. It's a group of citizens brought together to be representative in terms of the different neighborhoods, the demographics, and a whole bunch of other factors across Area D to guide this study. It oversees the work of the consultants, and it connects with the community. So the work that we do, Sherry and I report to the committee. We don't report to the province. We don't report to the regional district. We report to the committee. We take our direction from the committee. We provide all of the technical analysis that the committee requires in order to present to the community so that the community understands what the current services are, how decision-making currently works, and then gives feedback back to the committee in terms of the satisfaction level with the services, the satisfaction with the level of representation and decision-making, and whether some changes may wish to be explored. So one of the jobs for the committee then is, once it's heard back from the community and once it's reviewed all of the work the consultants have done, to make a recommendation to RDOS with respect to whether to proceed with an incorporation study. And then if there is a desire, based on community feedback, based on the analysis, to proceed with some kind of incorporation study, the question then is, what should the boundary be? What areas should we be considering for incorporation to a municipality? Okay, we are here in Area D, of course. We're going to talk a little bit about the context of Area D, and we'll talk a little bit about Okanagan Falls in particular, the part of Area D that we're in right now, of course. First of all, when we look at Area D, it's a fairly populous area. It's the largest area by population in RDOS, so it's got a little over 4,000 people. It is at that size, it's bigger than a number of the municipalities, not just the region, not just the electoral area. So it's a decent size for all of Area D. It's got a decent assessment base as well. When we look at the assessment base, the overall size of the assessment base, oh, there we are, right up here in the, oh, I beg your pardon here. We see this assessment base here. It is a bigger assessment base than all the other electoral areas and than many of the municipalities as well. And why is that important? Because the assessment base, that is the value of all the land and improvements within the area, is one indication of the ability to provide services. Because when we think about a municipality, a possibility of going to a municipality in some part of the area, we want to ensure that that municipality is financial or could be financially viable, so that it has enough of a tax base to provide different kinds of services that residents may want both in the near term and the longer term. So we look to see what the overall size of the tax base is for the area. We also look to see, oops, wrong way there. We also look to see, we also check on the diversity of the tax base. Most places, I think all places actually, all centers, all local jurisdictions of British Columbia have a predominantly residential tax base. That means if we look at all the value of all the land and buildings within an area, most of that value would be assigned a residential classification. So it's mostly residential properties. But and that's fine, but we want to, wherever possible, mix into that group some other types of properties, business, industrial, those kinds of things, because those types of properties help to pay the bills at the end of the day. They do now as a regional district, but they also do in any municipality. So we want to ensure that if we are considering some kind of change, that we are going to be considering some kind of boundary that captures enough of a diversified tax base as well. When we look at Area D, we've got a number of different communities, of course, and as Matt noted, we've now gone to pretty much all of the different communities or collections of communities within Area D, this group being our last meeting. So I won't go through all of them, you know what they are, but we are focused here, of course, on Okanagan Falls. It's our largest one in terms of largest community in terms of population. So we've got about 2,300, almost 2,300 or 2,250 population. That's just of the latest census. We've got almost 1,300 dwellings. We have a number of different services provided by the regional district. Sherry talked about 39 services. A lot of those services are provided throughout Area D, but also in our area here in Okanagan Falls, we have a few services that are not provided throughout all of Area D, but are provided to parts of Area D, including Okanagan Falls. So that would be fire protection, for example, recreation, and the sewer system here, the regional district sewer system in Okanagan Falls. Those are things that are here and in a few parts of other parts of the area, but not for the entire area. We've got a couple of other features about Okanagan Falls Central here. We've got in our regional growth strategy, which is our long-term policy document for the entire Area D and the entire regional district for that matter, how we're going to accommodate growth over a longer-term period and where that growth is going to go. We are identified here as a primary growth area. So what that indicates is that from a planning perspective that's been informed by input from the community, this area is seen long-term as being a primary growth area, an area where growth is going to occur and where growth is going to be encouraged in the long term. We have an Okanagan Falls irrigation district, of course, so that's our improvement district, and we have that improvement district provides water service, sanitary park, and street lights. Okay, now I noted that there are 39 different services provided throughout Area D, and when we look at, and it's important that we look at how services are provided in regional districts, in unincorporated areas, because when we think about possible changes to the area, we want to understand what we have in place today, and we want to get a sense also as to whether we're satisfied with what we have in place today. Is our current mix of services sufficient for what we need, or is it deficient in some way in the sense it's lacking something? And so we'll ask those questions in a moment, but just to give a little bit of an overview first, we've got 39 different services throughout the electoral area, including here in Okanagan Falls. Regional districts are unique in that they have a number of different service roles. The regional district is not only the primary service provider to this area, but it's also the local government for the area. Unlike a municipality where you'll have the municipality will be the local government. In our area here, the regional district is our local government. So it's responsible, first of all, for providing a number of local services. to Area D. And that would be, for example, economic development is just for Area D. That's something that's just provided to us. And there's a number that are just provided to us in Area D. Regional districts also, though, provide what are called sub-regional services. These are services, we've given an example here, mosquito control. Another one I believe is recycling garbage, and there's a bunch of services that we can think of that are services that are not provided to all jurisdictions of the regional district, but are provided to a handful of jurisdictions, more than one, but not all. So it'd be Area D plus a number of others in some cases. And then finally, we have region-wide services. These are services provided by the regional district across the entire region. All jurisdictions, all of the 9 electoral areas, all of the municipalities would belong to those services. One example is 911 emergency. So that service is provided right across the regional district. So regional districts are interesting because they provide services at different levels. And at our level here in Okanagan Falls, they are the local government, and they provide not only those broader regional services, but also all the local services, or many of the local services. And I caught myself in saying all the local services because that's not the case, because we also, as an unincorporated area, rely on the provincial government to provide some local services. Notably, local roads. So the province in an unincorporated area, like Okanagan Falls, like Area D as a whole, the province is responsible for providing your road system. That means the province maintains it, they sweep it, or they don't. They do the snow clearing, they do the maintenance, and the upkeep, and all that kind of stuff. That is a provincial responsibility, and they are set up through the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure to provide roads and to maintain roads in rural areas. They don't pretend for a moment, and they're not intended to be providers of a higher level of urban road that we tend to kind of move towards as we get bigger populations and bigger needs. And so that's why you don't see in rural areas or unincorporated areas, you don't see generous shoulders for biking or walking or cycling paths or those kinds of amenities, because the province says in unincorporated areas, we provide a rural standard of road, we pay for it, we collect a little bit of money back from people, but we pay the lion's share of it, and but you get what you get, and we set the standards for that. The province also provides local policing, and then of course they provide schools and health through other authorities such as the health authority and the school district. Now we have RDOS as the main service provider in Area D in Okanagan Falls. We have the province as an important local service provider, particularly as it relates to roads and police. And we also then have a couple of other ideas or providers in Area D as a whole. We've got our improvement districts, so we've got our Okanagan Falls Irrigation District as an improvement district. And then in some places we have some private utilities. So Heritage Hills, for example, has a private utility or 2 private utilities. We've got a couple of others as well. In your package of handouts, we have one of the handouts is a sample tax notice that we put together for a hypothetical property of $450,000 assessment. Now, nobody has the exact $450,000 assessment on their property, the residential property, but when we look at all the properties for Area D, the average comes out to about $450,000 for the value of the land and the improvement on that land. In here, we talk a little bit about how we show how all the services kind of line up, and we also importantly show how they're paid for. So what we see here is when we look at RDOS services provided to the entire electoral area, you'll notice when you look at the regional district tax notice, which is actually sent out by the provincial government, but it's for your regional district services, everything is itemized. So whether it's grants and aid, general government, Area D rural projects, planning, regional growth strategy, building inspection, everything has its own line. And everything indicates what you as the owner of a $450,000 property pay for that specific service. And that's important because one of the features of regional districts is that transparency, that itemization, so that you know exactly what you're receiving and you know what you're paying for. And one of the reasons it's kind of laid out like that is because all of these different services provided by the regional district may have different service areas. If we go back to those 3 different buckets, some of these services will be in one bucket, some will be in another bucket, and some will be in a third bucket. And each bucket will kind of have a different service area or will be provided to a different group of people. So we want to make sure when we receive our tax notices that we identify the services that we are part of and that we're paying for. And if we don't see other services on there, it's because we're not paying for those. We only pay for what we receive. And this gives you just a sense of the volume and the variety of services. We also see on here under our second category, we see regional district services provided to portions of Area D only. And this is typically where we start to see our utilities. So, but we also then see like fire protection. So not everybody gets fire protection. We get it here in Okanagan Falls, but not everybody in Area D gets it or pays for it. Recreation, same kind of thing. Our OK Falls sewer, we get that here. They don't get that in other places. So those kinds of things are laid out as well, again, so it's very clear on what's provided to us and what we pay for. We have the provincial services for all of Area D, our police tax, our rural tax, which is the tax the province collects to pay for roads. So you do pay towards your road system. The province subsidizes that a little bit while you're unincorporated, but you do pay something. You pay for this value of property about $202. Okay, there we go. Okay, now, Matt noted that in 2016, Sherry was part of a study here that was done earlier, the result of which was to split Area D as it was at the time into Areas D and I. We're still part of Area D. One of the things that was done at that time was to reach out to each community. So Okanagan Falls was identified separately and it was canvassed separately and surveyed separately and identify, ask questions, what do we think about our services? What are we satisfied with? What are we not satisfied with? And you can see this kind of word cloud here. It identifies just by the size of the font which the key issues were. So water stands out very much there, developments there, economic development stands out. The services that 80% of people who were surveyed or responded to the survey at least found were either very satisfied or satisfied. Fire protection, solid waste, water, parks and recreation. Very unsatisfied or unsatisfied with bylaw enforcement. So that's what we heard in 2016. We found the issues of the day were economic development, water, roads, policing, bylaw enforcement, and planning. So pretty core local government issues that really allow a community to function well. Those were the issues that were identified in 2016. In 2016, 58% of you and your neighbors who responded agreed that they received good value for the taxes that I paid to the regional district. 42% agreed that one electoral area director was sufficient for the combined area at that time, Area D and Area I, and 40% disagreed with that. It said that one electoral area director was not sufficient in terms of the amount of representation. So that's kind of 6 years ago what we heard, and we wanted to ask kind of today, if we go forward now, like do you feel you receive good value for the taxes you pay for now for the services you receive from RDOS? So your regional district being the local government for the area, your local government being your local service provider, your primary local service provider, do you feel you get good value for the taxes you pay, for the services that you get? You can reflect on that, or you can even better, you can speak out to it now at this meeting. Yes, sir.
My name is Doug, and the question that I have is that we would really like to be incorporated because you want to get more business here. How can you get more business if you don't have a police department? We have no protection. It's absolutely terrible. Everybody would agree. And the derelict cars and the derelict buildings, we can do nothing about. So do we get our value from the RDOS? I don't think so.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you.
I'm Parker. I'm with the local fire department here. One thing I would also like to see this, well, probably village at this point become incorporated, because I would like the village to be able to petition the province to see about trying to get better ambulance services here, because most of the ambulances that we basically are waiting for when we respond to somebody's home are coming from Penticton, sometimes Summerland, Oliver, Caramias. We've got nothing that's particularly local.
Thank you very much.
Can you just go back to
Thank you, please.
a question here? I'm just wondering, can you tell us roughly what percentage of your calls are primarily to the ambulance support?
Wrong.
Oh,
I can't take the mic off the stand, sorry. This is a really good question and very important. And I'm going to give some data here, some information. 2018, the regional district has 7 fire departments. They're like ours, volunteer fire departments. There's 7 of them. We had 233 call-outs. That's more than double second place, which was Kalidi. Call-outs include first responder, medical emergencies, and structural fires, car crashes, and the list goes on. I have details, anybody who wants them. Our medical emergency call-outs alone were more than the second place fire fall at about 125. Fast forward, 2019, we went from 233 to 237. 2020, we dropped to 186. This is a big deal. Why? Some people might think it was COVID. It was not. The 911 ambulance service, for political reasons in municipalities in the lower mainland, fighting with fire departments for budget, stopped sending ambulances to our neighborhood. Under the rules, if there's an ambulance not within 20 minutes, which means every call, fire gets dispatched. Now, this fire department has saved lives. I know people who are alive who would be dead. Let's fast forward to 2021, just finished. 268 call-outs, and again, about half are first responders. No ambulance, it's the fire department that shows up. The value for money here is unbelievably good. So far this year, over 30 first responder call-outs. I met with Chief Dobransky last week on this. This is a big deal if you understand it. So the question, wow, you're right, big deal. For anybody here who knows somebody who's had a fall, a heart attack, a stroke, 2020, we had a person on Hody, had a stroke, waited 46 minutes for an ambulance, fire department was not called. They lived, but what if they didn't? These are details, I know, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great questions, and thank you for giving us your views on that as well. One thing which is very interesting about both questions, police, fire, they both speak to, or I beg your pardon, police, ambulance, they both speak to services that even beyond an incorporation would be provided still by the provincial government. The difference, however, one might argue, is that a separate, and this is where we start to get into decision making and in the actual governing body. So the idea of having a mayor and council as opposed to one electoral area director on a larger board, the difference may be that having your own local council would give you more of an advocacy voice, more of a voice to kind of be working with the RCMP, to be working with the ambulance service, to lobby for more service, to lobby for those higher services, and you just don't get the same input opportunities with an electoral area director that you would get with the council. Yes, sir.
My name is Eugene. I just have a question in that if Okanagan Falls became incorporated, could our local fire department put a request to the provincial government to have an ambulance located here?
Absolutely, and it has to be said that they could do that now as well. And again, the difference may be that with a municipal council helping to advocate, you may get a slightly different response. But as Ron mentioned, these issues are not unique. The ambulance issues are not unique to Okanagan Falls or to unincorporated areas. We're seeing that in the Lower Mainland. We see that in Kelowna, West Kelowna, and the larger cities here as well, where the ambulance service has just really kind of dropped the ball for a whole bunch of different reasons: staffing issues, political issues, what have you. So it's going forward, we are going to continue to see local fire halls having to bridge the gap, if you will, fill the gap, and keep responding onto those medical calls. And we see that everywhere. That 50% metric that Ron talked about is 50% medical calls. That's pretty standard, whether you're dealing with an urban department or a rural department that has that first responder service. But I think that it is, you could certainly request that. You may get a better response or more of a response because you would be putting it through your council, and they could give more energy to that. But it wouldn't be a slam dunk by any stretch. Yes, sir.
Part of the ambulance and the lobbying from municipal governments, local government, is that in this area a number of the part-time ambulance used to be, if you want to say paid on call, so there'd be a standby. You get $2 an hour as a standby waiting at the ambulance center. You get paid for every call. That was discouraging a number of individuals from going full-time with the ambulance because of the lobbying. And to be corrected, I believe it was 8 of the ambulance halls are now staffed full-time, and that was because of the lobbying of local municipalities, local villages.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Okay, let's move on a little bit, and I encourage everybody, as Sherry noted earlier, to please take a moment just to fill out your feedback form, because we do want to. It's very important for the committee to hear as we go forward and as they kind of work their way towards a recommendation on whether to proceed with an incorporation study, and if so, who should be included in that study. It's very important for the committee to receive that feedback so that it can point to that and so that it can assess that and digest that. Moving along, if we could, let's talk a little bit about decision making, because this is the other really key point. And at this point, perhaps even more than the service provision element, the decision making, the governance, because governance is really all about decisions and who makes decisions and how are they made. And it's the decision making or the governance that really draws the line kind of between, or makes a clear distinction between unincorporated local government through a regional district, an electoral area, and incorporated through a municipality. This is where we see the big differences in the systems come about. In our current system with our regional district board, we have a regional district, which is comprised of municipalities, yes, that are separate legal entities within the regional district, but also electoral areas. And the regional district, as I noted, is the local government for the electoral areas, and the governing body of the regional district is the regional district board. So we send, from Okanagan Falls, from Area D, we elect and we send one electoral area director to sit on that board. Every other electoral area of the regional district sends another electoral area director to the board. So we have a total of 9 electoral area directors. It's one electoral area director from each electoral area, no matter what the size of that area is in terms of area or population. So no matter how big or small, one person. From the municipalities, we've got 6 municipalities in regional district. They appoint members from their municipal councils to go sit on the regional board as municipal directors. The distinction between municipal directors and electoral area directors is not great, other than the fact that electoral area directors are elected directly to the board, whereas municipal directors are appointed by their governments to the board. But they all have votes at the board, and they vote on key issues at the board. So let's just talk about how this works now in terms of voting at the board, because this is the how decisions are made as part of this decision-making body. And it's very specific. We've got some very specific rules to guide decision making at regional districts. When we have a municipal council, I'll just state by witness, note by kind of way of comparison. When we have a municipal council, it's very straightforward. Every member of council, mayor and either 4 councilors or 6 councilors, depending on which size of the body is chosen. Every member of council has 1 vote and votes on every issue, period. When we look at regional districts, we have different combinations of votes. We have on different issues, different directors get a vote, different directors don't get a vote. For instance, in some cases, different directors on some issues get more than 1 vote, different directors get fewer, not less than 1 vote, but at least fewer than the others. So different numbers of votes, different directors voting in different cases. We have 3 different types of votes. We have what are called first unweighted corporate votes. Unweighted corporate votes are taken for matters such as when a new service is set up by the regional district, or when we have a regulatory bylaw that we are voting on at the regional district. Those matters are matters on which every director at the regional board has 1 vote and votes. So they're matters typically that will affect the entire region, because the entire region and the regional board is that legal entity, the regional district is the legal entity, and it becomes responsible for all the new services that are created, for example, for the exercising the regulatory authority. We also have what are called corporate votes that are weighted. In these votes, every director gets a different number of votes to cast. And the number of votes that is given to an individual director is dependent on the size of the population that that director represents. So on those ones, everybody gets to vote because they're corporate votes, but everybody gets different numbers of votes based on the jurisdictions and populations that they represent. We vote on those for financial matters, such as when we pass the annual budget, and we also do it when we buy property or dispose of property. And those are important because the whole corporation, everybody on the board votes for that, because it is the board, it's the regional district corporation that takes some liability on when you pass a budget and you start to raise money, or when you acquire property. So those are important corporate images or corporate issues for the entire corporation, but we again assign votes based on population. The third one, stakeholder votes for weighted votes. So on a service like recycling and garbage, for example, on that service doesn't include everybody. We have certain jurisdictions that are part of that. The directors from those jurisdictions get to vote, and the number of votes that each director gets is dependent on the population. So how does this all look then when we kind of look at, well, what kind of authority, what kind of influence does a director, an individual director, have on these votes? In Area D, on a corporate weighted vote, so this would be passing the annual budget, purchasing land, those kind of important financial issues. Area D's director, Ron, gets 3 votes of it's actually 57, right?
54 now. It's moving to 57 because of the census.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to 57 because of the census. Yes, so 3 votes of ultimately, once the census kicks in, 57 votes on those corporate weighted votes. And you can see kind of graphically how this looks. Penticton gets 37% of the votes. Area D gets 5% of the overall votes for those issues. So when the budgets are put together for the services that you pay for and receive, your director participates in those votes, as does every other director on the board, and your director gets about 5% of the vote on that matter. Okay, one other rule is that we cannot have a situation, if we go back and think about those buckets of services, well, the first bucket was the local services, and there were a bunch of services that were only provided to Electoral Area D. So of the 39 services, a bunch of those are only provided by the regional district to this electoral area, not to other electoral areas. Now, on votes for those services, everybody on the board gets to vote, because we can't have a situation where only one director gets to say, because it's considered not democratic. And so under our system, then everybody around the table votes for those. So on those ones, everybody votes. So all of these different rules taken together for Area D mean that every decision made by the board on an Area D service involves directors from at least one other jurisdiction and often all jurisdictions. Now, for some people, that's problematic because we think about accountability, we think about who we're voting for, and do they have a say, and why are people that we have no ability to elect or take out of office voting on things that affect us and that we pay for? So a lot of people have concerns about that. Other people, though, kind of look to the system and how it was designed and say, well, regional districts are federations. Regional districts are federations of jurisdictions that choose to provide services together because they can do more together than on their own. And they choose to provide those services, they choose to pay for those services together, and they choose to govern those services together. So different representatives from different areas participate jointly in decision-making for those services. Both those systems, that system and a municipal system where we have decisions made entirely by a municipal council of people elected locally and accountable to the local population, both of those systems are equally legitimate for different reasons, but they're both very different from one another. And as we look at unincorporated areas around the province, when communities are formed and historically, often people will move to unincorporated areas or choose to be in unincorporated areas because the service needs are low, the cost of the services are low, the interest in having more government intervention in decisions and providing services is not typically there. And that's all legitimate, that's all good. And so those folks who choose that kind of lifestyle, who choose to live in those communities, they typically like to have an electoral area type of government, our system in which basic rural services are provided very well by a regional district, because that's what they're very good at, providing basic local services of lower costs and sharing decision-making authority and sharing the cost of those services with folks in other smaller communities. And that's very appropriate in many places, and a lot of people like that system. Often what we find is as places grow, as places' aspirations, needs, wishes for the future, service desires, service issues, if we have a failing service, for example, economic development interests, those kinds of things, as demographics change and more people move in, as those issues kind of change over time, what we see in all provinces, and British Columbia is no exception, is there's often a movement among citizens to say, let's change the way we're governing ourselves, because the system we had in place when we were very small and very happy to be small was great then, but we've changed now as a community and we want to move to a different system that gives us more control locally over the decisions that we think are important for our community. Both systems, again, equally legitimate. It's not about one that's right and one that's wrong. It's about what's right for the community at any particular time. So let me ask, if I could, okay, when we think those different systems I talked about, where we have one electoral area director on a board of 19 participating in the decisions for local services provided here and for the community, versus a municipal council of either 5 or 7 of locally elected folks here accountable to the community, elected by the community, accountable to the community, and making decisions for the community. Think about those two differences and give me a sense as to kind of where you are right now in terms of what you prefer. Does one electoral area director give you the level of representation and influence or control over decisions that is fine right now for the community, or is that no longer fine from where we are for the community's kind of point in time, as it were? Please come on up.
Hi, I'm Melody Walker, and I want to say right off the start that my mom sits on the committee, but we are totally separate entities, and my experiences here, she may or may not agree with, but I'm speaking specifically from my own direct experiences.
Thank you.
And the RDOS director, Ron Obrick, most definitely is not able to represent and influence the decision making for the community. And bear with me, I'm gonna give you some quick
Absolutely.
examples of what I've gone through specifically.
Please.
And he has to interact with the province, so I'm gonna start with provincial. Modi, try to get things done with regards to lanes. It is very top down, and if you don't like how they're doing things and you try to ask for accountability, the reaction is, no, we're not gonna be accountable, and too bad if you don't like it. Case in point, the fighting for years to get a crossing in Cedar Street, they finally put it in, and they didn't put lights that show the people that need that light to cross. You see people going out into the middle of the highway to look to see if the lights have changed yet, if it's safe. Go back to Modi and say, why did you do it that way? We're not gonna bother answering your question. Secondly, policing. Come up with an example. We have no proactive enforcement. Come up with an example and say, well, maybe Oliver already does enforcement to Oliver Ranch Road. They need more members because of the jail. Maybe they could include OK Falls as their area. Maybe that would be better than particularly providing our policing when we supposedly have a rural policing system. Try to talk to the RCP and the provincial government about exactly what dollars are coming back to this area based on rural taxes that are paid, exactly how they've decided on the rural policing, exactly why there is no proactive policing. And if you make a suggestion, like maybe this would be a solution, again, top down, nope, well, why not? Too bad we're not answering. Thirdly, 911 dispatch. Never mind the ambulances even trying to respond to the call, try to get through to dispatch. Wait on hold forever. They took it away from Penticton, based out of Kelowna now, and perhaps Handouts. Talk about 911 response to even say, send the ambulance versus send the fire department, send the police. Talk to the government about how the 911 dispatch system is set up. Top down. Your question's too bad, this is the way we're doing it. Now, go to your rural taxes that are being paid. A lot of people don't realize your rural taxes, the money that you pay doesn't come back to those services specifically for this area. Your rural taxes go into the province's general coffers. And that means your rural taxes don't necessarily come back to this area. They can go to wherever the province decides they need them. And yeah, there's times of need, but overall, many years in a row, we haven't had dollars come back to this area based upon the tax base for this area. Then lastly, with the RDOS, whether you agree with something that the RDOS is doing or isn't doing, have any of you ever sat through an RDOS board meeting? Have you joined it via Zoom? Have you seen whether you agree with what Ron is trying to do, perhaps for you specifically, or you don't agree with the stand? He has so little impact on what specifically is going to happen to this area because of weighted votes or unweighted votes. And that can work in one of two ways. Politically, if he speaks against you, the other directors that don't really have a fat far clue about what's going on don't want to rock the boat politically within that organization, so they'll just all vote with what he's doing. Or he is standing up for you, but it might take money that another director doesn't want to have come out of, again, general coffers. You have to realize, people, Area D and OK Falls in particular, the population base, the money that you pay for services and whatnot, goes to the RDOS, and it is in general coffers. And then the RDOS decides how they're spending the money. And if directors in Naramata and Kaleden and Apex get together and decide, hey, if that money goes to OK Falls town site, quote unquote, there isn't going to be any money for what we want. So the political stuff that goes on internally, Ron has done an excellent job in the Skaha Matters of trying to explain the details of how limited he is to try to get things done for this area, including all of the grants that we can't go for. So I just wanted, I know that's been kind of long-winded, but I've been bashing my head against brick walls for years, trying to have things addressed specifically with roads, with policing, with enforcement, with upgrades, and talking to Ron and having him say, I can't get it done. So no, Ron isn't able to represent this area in decision-making adequately, no matter how much he wants to. The current system is brutal and that does not meet our needs.
Thank you very much. And I want to make just one or two comments not in response, but just to kind of around those, if I may. When we think of the you started off, Matt, by talking first of all about roads and then and Modi in particular, and then RCMP and so forth. And yes, I understand exactly what you're saying in terms of the level of service, in terms of the willingness to do things differently, in terms of the willingness to add services, in terms of the ability to provide input into those decision-making bodies. And it kind of goes back to something I mentioned earlier, because, and it's a little bit about the transition that communities have over time. So the province will say, Modi exists from an unincorporated area perspective. Modi exists to provide a basic, bare bones level of rural road service. If you want a crosswalk, if you want a bike path, if you want a shoulder, or if you want better lighting, you know what? There's a remedy for that. Start your own community. Incorporate and you can get that. And you'll pay for it, but you can get that. So, because Modi, we're not positioned to do that, and we don't pretend we're able to do that, because that's not what we do. We do a really good job at the basics, and for many people, that's all they want. But for other people who are in a more populated area and who have different needs and who have different aspirations, that's not enough. And we see that in many places around the province where we make that transition. The policing as well, we get for unincorporated areas, you just don't have the ability to provide that input. In other areas, in municipalities, even you may not be at a population where you're actually responsible for the service, but the mechanisms exist to provide input into that service, and that's one of the differences. And again, the RCP and Solicitor General would say, in smaller places, we provide the basic. We don't give that opportunity for input because our job as a province in very small unincorporated places is to make sure that basics are taken care of. If you want more than the basics, that's why we have the incorporation option available to you. One thing I will say, just to clarify one point, if I may, with respect to the general revenues, the regional district doesn't actually have general revenues. Every service is captured in its own firewalled separate account fund. But I think the point maybe you're getting at those, when you have a service that involves more than one area, everybody from those different areas pays into that fund, and then the regional district can determine how to use that fund. So some of your dollars may go to a different area.
One thing, I don't need a mic. One thing too, I don't know if people are aware of, but right now the RDOS, our rules, our bylaws. Right now the RDOS is trying to change so that A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I are all the same bylaws. So exactly the same rules apply to every district, and you're going to have even less specificity in terms of having specific needs met for a certain area, because their way of governance, that's what's on the table right now. Ron can speak to it in more detail. I'm saying in layman's terms, but that's what they're trying to do. The same bylaws are going to apply to every region, and Area D is going to be the same as Area C, the same as Area H, the same as Area A. You will not have specific representation for your needs and for bylaws that directly impact your area. I believe I'm interpreting that correctly.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pass the microphone over to my colleague. I'm going to say one final point, and I'm not disagreeing with anything the previous speaker has said. I just want to emphasize again that idea that the regional district system is actually kind of working as it should, but that doesn't mean it's the best system for every community at the place that community is at now. So it may have been great at one point for the needs that you had then. If your needs are different, it may not be the right system. Okay, over to Sharon.
I have a question before we get going here.
You say we have 39 services that we get from the RDOS, correct? What do the other districts get? Or what does Oliver get? Do they only get 16 because they're incorporated and we get 39 services from the RDOS?
Okay. So when we think of 39 services, if we look at Oliver, yeah, they'll have, if you could break that down, they'll have just the same services.
But are they looked after by the RDOS?
No.
Thank you.
Our services aren't looked after.
That's the quick answer. And we will come back to that point in a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the boundary considerations. And when we are drawing a boundary for an incorporation study area, what are the details that we start to look at? So a lot of what we do look at is really technical data, or it's a technical analysis. And I've got this graphic, and you have it in your handouts as well, because this is kind of how I think of it, because it's like putting layers of maps or layers of data on top of each other and sort of aggregating them, putting them all on top of each other and trying to figure out exactly where the boundary that makes sense. I know another committee member of ours has described it slightly differently, and she likes to look at it as ingredients for making a cake. So we're going to look at the different ingredients that would go into making a good incorporation study area. So we look at things like regional growth strategies, which we've talked about a little bit, the areas that are anticipated for growth areas. Same with your official community plan. It identifies areas that would be appropriate for growth and already labels those areas. And those documents have already gone through quite an extensive public process to figure out where those boundaries are. So we use those. We use things like census data and figure out exactly where the population is right now. We look at the local government services. So where is the infrastructure already? Where are those sewer service areas? Where are the water service areas? Where do we have infrastructure that is being used and that maybe can be expanded on and that needs to be paid for? Where are the local road networks? We've talked about that. We usually want to consider quite a compact area, because when you incorporate, as Alan's mentioned already, you do get the responsibility for paying for those roads. So you don't want the long roads that go into the middle of nowhere that have not a lot of population base at the end of them, because you're going to be the ones paying for plowing that road and cleaning that road and the snow clearing. So we look at where the local road networks are. We also spend quite a bit of time with property assessment information. So you need a significant tax base to be able to spread out those costs of doing things like looking after roads or sewer or water. So you want to have a certain amount of property tax base, but you also want different property classes. So Alan mentioned earlier what our property assessment base is. It's primarily residential, but it does include some industrial areas, some commercial areas, and different property classes. You want to continue to have a range of those property classes in your incorporation study area. You don't want to be all residential, for instance. You want to have that balance, and one of the reasons being that when you're a municipality, you have the ability to adjust the tax ratios between property classes. That's something that, and I'll go back to this, but that's something that regional districts can't do, but that municipalities have the ability, depending on what their commercial tax base is or their industrial tax base, they might want to adjust what those ratios are, either to attract more or to change the balance of who's paying for the taxes. One of the other things we look at is agricultural land reserve. So we usually try to avoid including too much farm class properties within the municipal boundary. One of the reasons being is that actually tax exemptions change for them whether they're in an incorporated area or whether they're not. So that's one of the reasons. There might be other areas that sometimes properties with fairly high assessment values that you want to include in the area, but agricultural land reserve is one of those pieces of data that we layer on top of it, or one of those cake ingredients. And another one of those ingredients is community input. So again, that's one of the reasons we're here. We want to understand what service concerns you might have, or service level concerns, because that's one of the criteria, one of the layers of data that we will consider, especially if some of the concerns that you have are things that would be resolved or more easily addressed if you were incorporated. And we've touched on some of those, you've touched on some of those already. So we want to understand what your concerns are, and again, your interest in proceeding, right? That's one of the ingredients to the cake. Once we put those things together, again, to try and determine what that viable municipal incorporation study area boundary would be, that boundary gets recommended in a report that goes to the committee. The committee then makes a recommendation. They have to endorse a preferred boundary at the end of this study. They would make that recommendation to the RDOS board. And again, if they've recommended that they think it's appropriate that we move forward with an incorporation study, then they would be making that recommendation to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs. And ultimately, it's the province that would have to agree with that boundary. It's okay. So I want to talk a little bit about incorporation impacts. So the incorporation study is the study that looks exactly at what the boundary is and what the tax impact would be. So we can't really speak to the tax impacts until we know exactly where that boundary is, because that's how we establish what our tax base would be. And without those details, we'd be generalizing about costs that we wouldn't be able to substantiate. But there are some changes that we can speak to because we know they will happen in an incorporation. Some of these are service changes, some of them are governance changes, and some of them are how things are financed and costs. So on service changes, and again, we've touched on some of these already, but we know that who provides the service would change in an incorporation. And some of these are provincial services now that would become the responsibility of the municipality. So we know that we would get the responsibility for local roads. That would automatically become the municipal responsibility if for an incorporated area. Subdivision approval, that's something that's currently provided by the province. Once you're incorporated, that becomes the responsibility of the municipality. And tax collection, you may not know that currently you actually, regional districts don't do that, but you pay the province to collect the taxes on your behalf, and you pay a fee for that on your taxes. That would become the responsibility of the municipality. Most of the local services that you have right now from your local government, which is the RDOS, regional district, most of those decisions would actually be made, and those services would be the responsibility of an incorporated area. That doesn't mean that the municipality would have to deliver those services. So the gentleman in the back there that just mentioned, some of the services, if you like the service that you get from the regional district right now, you think that you get good value for it because they have economies of scale for maybe it's garbage collection and recycling, the municipality could decide to continue to participate in that service with the regional district. So even though they get the right to make that decision, you could still decide to be part of that service, and lots of municipalities do. Karamias get some services, for instance, from the regional district, because that makes sense for their incorporated area. As a municipality, there are some services that you would have the authority for that regional districts don't. We mentioned up here, business licensing is one of those services. You'd have that ability, if it makes sense for your incorporated area, to have business licensing. There's a few others. Obviously, with the authority for local roads come things like parking and signage and speed limits. You have authority for those things that you don't currently have. Governance changes. And again, we've talked about this already, but obviously your governing body would change, and it changed from having one electoral area director sitting on the RDOS board to having 5 council members, or maybe 7 council members, just depending on the body that is the council size that is determined. Those people would be elected by your municipal area. You would still have one municipal director on the RDOS, so on the RDOS board, sorry. So you're not really losing any representation on the RDOS board, but you would have this local council, and almost all your decisions would be made through that local council. The province, however, would continue to make decisions on policing. Because you would be a community of less than 5,000, you wouldn't, your payment wouldn't, well, there would be a slight change in the tax analysis, so that would show up in the incorporation study. But they would be continuing to provide policing because you have less than 5,000. If your community then goes over 5,000 at some point, you actually start paying more for your policing at that point. You also get a little bit more responsibility over and control over the decisions on it. But under 5,000, again, and Alan mentioned this, but your council will have the ability to provide a little more input, but it still would be the province making those decisions. Finance changes. So the service costs may change, and again, that's going to depend on the tax base, and that's what the incorporation study is for, to really go drill down into those details of how those costs might change based on whatever we come up with for your incorporation study area. And I mentioned this already, but municipalities have that option to change the tax ratios. So right now, the regional district residents pay one tax rate. If you're a business, you pay 2.45 times that rate. In a municipality, they might decide that we actually think it should be a little bit higher than that, or they could decide that it's a little bit lower than that, based on whatever their local priorities are, but they do have the ability to adjust it, whereas regional districts do not. Municipalities have some new revenue streams that regional districts don't have access to. One of these is called franchise fees. So those are usually with Fortis BC when they're bringing natural gas into the area. So they give you a percentage for the ability to provide that service within your municipality. Others is a utilities tax that doesn't apply in regional districts. And this is a bigger one, and I think you will hear some of our, we're having a panel discussion this time next week. 1 o'clock next week on March 5th, we're having an online discussion with mayors from the two most recently incorporated communities in the province, West Kelowna and Barriere, and a representative from Clearwater as well. The three of those were incorporated in 2007. And they will talk about some of the changes that it meant for their community. And one of the things that I know, because we've had a similar panel discussion in an area where we're doing an incorporation study right now, where they say that the ability to apply for grants has been enhanced once you become a municipality. So regional districts and municipalities are eligible for grants. But when you're a regional district, you have many electoral areas, all of which are quite a large amount of areas, and several communities within those electoral areas. Some of those may want access to some of those grants, but figuring out the priorities of all the different little areas within your 9 electoral areas is quite a tall order. Never mind balancing who you're making the grant application on behalf of. How do you compare the grant application in Heritage Hills with one in Tulameen or wherever else it is? It's a tall order, whereas in a municipality, it's a much smaller area, you have access to the same grant, and you know your local priorities. So the council can decide, let's go after, we have a need for sewer, or our sewer needs upgrading, we're gonna go after those grants, and we're gonna choose to go after those grants every time they come up. So you don't necessarily have access to more grants, but you have a more focused opportunity to pursue your local priorities. So we have in the handout, we have referred to some reasons why you might want to be part of an incorporation study area and reasons why, again, you might not want to be. And we do want to present that, again, both perspectives are equally valid, and we're here to listen to and hear from what your perspectives are on this. But I'll touch on a couple and just read out a couple just to give you an example. So the reasons you might want to be part of an incorporation study area, you want to understand the cost and impact of having local control over services, land use planning, building inspection, utilities, recreation, bylaw enforcement, and others. Perhaps you're interested in the idea of having decisions on these things made and other community matters made by a locally elected council, and you want to appreciate what the costs and impact of that change would be on your community. And maybe you're uncertain whether incorporation would make sense, but you are interested in gaining a better understanding of those implications and having the opportunity, more importantly, to vote once that detailed analysis is available. Reasons why you might not want to be. Maybe you're totally content with the type and level of current local services provided to your community. Maybe you feel well represented by having one Electoral Area D director on the RDOS board, and you having a local governing council of 5 to 7 council members. Maybe you think that that's excessive relative to the needs of your community. And maybe you're satisfied that in the years ahead, the community can continue to be well governed and appropriately serviced as part of Electoral Area D in the RDOS, and therefore you're not interested in exploring other options at this time. Again, equally valid. We're here to listen to what comments that you have and how you might feel about that. We do have one of our questions and for our online poll, but also putting it out to you. Do you view your community as one that has shared goals and priorities with surrounding Area D communities, or one that has different needs and aspirations? And I'll just explain a little bit on why we're asking this question. The idea that when we're going back to that drawing of the boundary, we want to make sure that we understand where the communities of interest are and where you might have shared priorities with. Because if we're drawing a municipal boundary around you, you're going to be making decisions together. And so having shared interests and common priorities would be helpful. So, is that Okanagan Falls and Skaha Estates, or is that down to Vaso Lake? So figuring out who feels like they have shared interests enough to make a viable community going forward. I am going to stop there. I'm just going to touch on this last slide, but then for sure welcome any questions that you have after this. Put a plug in again. Fill out the feedback form, please. We do want to hear that feedback. We want to make sure we're listening from everybody. Leave it behind, or you can go online and fill it out online. The panel discussion, again, that discussion's happening online. I think we might be also booking this room for people who want to come and have a viewing party from a central location. But we will have all our attendees of the panel discussion online on March 5th at 1 p.m. And eventually, keep an eye out in your mailbox. You will be mailed a survey when we do get down to those boundary options to help us identify a preferred boundary. So everybody will get that survey mailed to them. Please feel free to ask questions.
Just a quick question on the survey.
Yes.
We've had an online question come in. Does the survey go to every resident or every residence? And is the residents allowed to respond even if they're not, if they're just a seasonal owner, or say they're an absentee landowner? Right. It will get mailed to, we are mailing it out to all the residents, just as we did the overview was mailed out to every resident in Area D. Yeah, and we would welcome, any property owners in the area, whether you're a seasonal resident or not. Again, if it goes to your mailbox here, then it might not be easy for you to pick up, but. And then, in addition to that, the referendum,
yes,
if we ever got to that point, same person asking, are they able to vote in that referendum if they don't live, this isn't a principal residence?
So if you're a BC property owner, then yes, you would be, and fit all the other voter eligibility, so over 18 and not otherwise excluded because you, are a member, people who've been to jail. So all the normal voting requirements, but BC residents, if you're a property owner, then yes. If you own a seasonal resident here, but you're not a BC resident, so if you're an Alberta resident, you don't get to vote in BC elections. Renters are residents, yes. Yeah, they would fulfill those requirements. So all residents of Area D, and then again, if it's your second residence, that's fine as long as you're a BC resident and fulfill all voter eligibility requirements. If it's owned by a corporation, you don't get to vote. Sorry to introduce the complications. Yes.
Yeah, that was
sort of speaks to my question anyways, is it only residents that get a say? And what about the businesses? Like you were mentioning that in actual fact, it's good that in the tax space we have a number of businesses, you know, along Oliver Ranch Road. We were amazed when we first moved here and saw the businesses there. Do they get a vote? Do they get a say? And is this type of material, is this, and if that is the case, is this type of material going to them for their consideration?
So they would be getting the information that we mail out, but businesses, if they are owned by a corporation, so if it's a business, if it's privately owned, if I like run a home business and it's in my name personally, then I would have a vote as a resident. But no, businesses don't, corporations don't get to vote.
Can I just clarify the decision-making process?
Can you go to the mic, please?
Sure. So what we're providing out is feedback that will inform what recommendations you guys make in terms of the boundary and whether or not to proceed. And then you'll do another survey on that. And that information will also inform the committee so they can make their recommendation, and they'll make their recommendation to the board, and then the board will make the decision. Is that fair?
Yes, although I think, I think the committee's recommendation will probably hold a lot of weight there because, again, they will be forwarding that to the RDOS, but the RDOS hasn't been going through the entire process. So I think they will probably be, and in most cases, we find that they defer to the decision of the committee. But yes, you nailed it. Yes.
You're elected.
Hi, my name is Annalise Chaprowski. With regards to economic development, and I've worked very hard over the last year and a bit to improve my corner of Okanagan Falls. With regards to putting more finances into the community, it's challenging for me to do that without the security of knowing that one of my property is protected in some ways. And also, I love our tourism industry and people that are coming to our town. But with regards to our bylaws and people that perhaps are staying longer than what they should on the beach, or let's say parking there, with their RVs or camping, it's still a little unclear to me if we do incorporate, are we going, as business owners, have that sense of confidence that we're going to be more on the radar bylaws or the RCMP? Or do we have to reach that 5,000 mark?
I'll just speak to the bylaws, and Alan can speak a little bit more to the RCMP authorities. So I think you'll have a council that would be elected locally that would have the local priorities will be more front and center, and you will develop your own bylaws for the municipality in response to that. So, and you would have some extra authorities for parking, for instance, and would be able to enforce those. So, enforcement and the locally created bylaws, yeah, there would be more opportunities to provide that local input to your local leaders, I would say.
We as a community would hire someone to enforce that?
The municipality would actually be responsible for their own bylaw enforcement. So, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get really high levels of bylaw enforcement, because you could if that was a priority for your community and that was communicated to your council. But that comes at a cost. The higher the bylaw enforcement is, a challenge for every municipality as well. So you would normally have a policy that would talk about response to different types of issues, but those would all be based on your local concerns and priorities, and you would have someone locally, your council, that you could go and talk to about that, which again is a little bit harder, and I'm sure Ron will touch on that in a minute. But with respect to the policing, I will let Alan.
Thank you very much. And I'll do this gentleman just a second there. Just with respect to the business role as well, one of the things under the legislation that applies to municipalities as opposed to regional districts that is different from a business perspective too is the ability to have a business improvement area. And that is an association in essence that is created, a business improvement area association that is created of business people in a particular area. It's put together by business people with the agreement of the municipality to provide certain improvements to a particular business area, paid for by the businesses, but often also contributed to by the municipality as a whole. So that's one key difference that you see in a municipality as well that is, I suppose, a benefit to business in that sense. On the RCMP, it's a very good question, and Sherry talked earlier about a discussion panel that we had recently. We're having one coming up this next week at this time for this area. Sherry and I participated in one recently for the Blind Bay Sorrento area in the Shuswap region, the Columbia Shuswap region. And on that discussion panel, we had mayors from 3 municipalities that had fewer than 5,000 people, which meant that they were not responsible for local policing. The province was continued to be responsible. And so that was relevant, particularly to this case here in Okanagan Falls. And one of the questions that was asked of those mayors was exactly what you just asked us. Do you, as a municipality, have more input to the RCMP than you had as an electoral area? And all 3 of those mayors said yes.
Alan and Sherry, I'm just wondering, it's almost 22 now.
Sure.
So what I'm going to suggest is
absolutely
we take Ron's chunk, and I think Ron had some input to a previous question that was asked as well. And then we'll come back to any questions that the group has, whether it comes to the committee or Ron.
Excellent.
Okay.
So this gentleman, we go first up after that.
Okay. Sorry about that. So we've got our Area D director, Ron Overeck. He's going to speak to his experiences at the board and how that impacts our decision on where the boundary is. He may also have his views on incorporation. We may also have a view on a question that was raised earlier on. So, Ron, here you go.
And thank you very much, Matt. Much appreciated. I want to say thank you to everybody who came today in person, everybody online. I'm here to listen. I hear what you're saying. I hear it when I'm not at a meeting like this. I hear all the time. And it means an awful lot to me that you show up. It means a lot to me that there's questions. And I think today the questions have been fantastic. The participation has been amazing. I want to say thank you to the consultants who have done a great job in this process and a great job tonight. There's a lot of information here. For some people, it may be too much information. It takes time to absorb all this. But wow, really, really good job, and thank you. I want to hit a couple points real fast before I get into the meat of what I came to say. With respect to Annalise's questions, Annalise, the short answer is yes, yes, yes. Better, better, better. And Sherry gave you some introduction. We would have authorities we don't have now for everything from abandoned vehicles to parking and the tool for enforcement. We don't have it now. We can't do it now. Not allowed. Big difference. Secondly, what Alan said, absolutely. The things we can do with respect to business community, what's been done elsewhere, Radium, Trail, Roslyn, Fort Langley, the list goes on. These are not new things. They're done elsewhere. We're not introducing or inventing something new. They're just things we can't do now. And these are not things that cost more money. More often than not, there's grant money that we're not getting to help us do these things because we don't qualify. This is a big deal. And third, on the policeman, and Alan is right, and I was pleased to hear what he said. I've had this conversation with those same communities, and the answer is yes, you get a better experience with policing. Yes, much better. On policing alone, most of you don't know this, and I've spoken with Superintendent Ted Jagger and with Superintendent Brian Hunter, his replacement, and other members, and we get quarterly reports at the board from the police. I can tell you our crime rate is one of the lowest in the regional district, Okanagan Falls. Now, for those of you who are in the town center and know the crime, you know that we're not getting the service that we're paying for. That's a bottom line truth. Ted Jagger acknowledged it on January 14, 2019 at a meeting I had with him to express our concerns. Superintendent Brian Hunter has as well. Long story made short, our money goes to Penticton. Penticton has the highest call-out rate in the province of Alberta, or BC, about 225 call-outs per member, and that is number one with a bullet. Second is like 75. 75. It is unspeakable. Now, Penticton needs more resources. That's manpower, that's money. Their council makes decisions. Our money goes for manpower in Penticton. I don't think Alan knows this. So what happens is we pay, but we don't get the service. And Superintendent Ted Jagger said to me, it's not an excuse, it's an explanation. They're too busy. Superintendent Brian Hunter said, sorry, but we can't keep up. Now here's the good news. Our crime rate's really, really low in our area. And I can go into great detail with people on a different day. So that's with respect to Annalise's question. I don't know if Mel is still here. If you are, Mel, I can't see you. Mel, I just want to say this. Well said. Really well said. You did a good job. I think people heard you. But well said. Mel and her family have been here a long time. They know a lot. But she articulated a lot of issues very well. Now, I want to say in my experience and in my opinion, and I want you to know that I see Malcolm shaking his hand. So do you have a concern, Malcolm?
I have a big concern.
Okay. Well, please raise it.
Yeah, well, my name is Malcolm. We run the all-day resort down here on the beach. We're talking policing. We have no police. Okay? We just don't. I have called in recent years, and I've talked to Ron over this. You were gracious enough to meet me. And we just don't have it. They don't come. I have people invading the resort every single day. They're showering in my pond. They're shitting in my garbage cans. They tell the people that come over from the beach to our place to go have a real nice day. I call the cops. You know my response is? Well, no, not unless there's actually somebody hurt or murdered. We can't come. I have taken it upon myself, and I know what you're dealing with at the same time. We're neighbors, basically. I have to go next door and get my friends from our trailer park, which we own next door. We go down there and kick some ass. And then everybody says to me, oh, you can't do that. Well, if you can't protect the town you're in, what do you got? It's up to the people. Now, if the people take it into their own hands, now we're Mr. Bad. And I've told Ron this many times. I go down there and I do my business. And I don't care what the police say. I don't care what council says. I take care of business. Because I'm not going to let them frighten, scare, or terrorize that beach in the summer. I can't even get a sign put on the beach because I got to go through so many different sources.
Malcolm, I want to say thank you.
And that's
important.
Bullshit.
Yeah, your point is well made. For everybody's benefit, including Malcolm's, I've had communications with the police on these issues, and indeed I have a meeting set for the middle of March with our liaison constable and another constable. And I will be bringing back to the community a public meeting, probably in this room, as soon as we can. COVID, of course, has caused us delays in getting the kind of community meetings that we need to have. I'm thrilled with the turnout tonight. Moving on from Malcolm's comments, and thank you for those, Malcolm. I want to pick up on a couple of points that have been made already. In my experience and opinion, the regional district system is designed for and best suited for rural areas, not urban. Municipalities, they're for urban areas, and that's the distinction. And I want to give you some information to illustrate. We have 162 municipalities in the province of BC. We have 28 regional districts. The regional districts have 11% of the population. They have 89% of the land area. Municipalities, by contrast, have 89% of the population and 11% of the land area. What that means, and if you talk to, which I have, talked to the mayors of every regional district in our regional district, we have 6 municipalities, 9 electoral areas. All of them could unincorporate and be like us. I've asked them all. Nobody's interested. Not Caramil's, not Oliver, not Osoyoos, not Princeton. I've talked to municipalities outside this area. None of them are interested. People who understand why don't want to be like us. And so when we look at the differences, what makes us different than the other 8 electoral areas? Again, Alan has alluded to this. We have a regional growth strategy for the entire 10,500 square kilometers that is our regional district. We have 7 growth areas recognized, 7. 6 of those are the municipalities. 1 is us. We have 9 electoral areas. 1 is a growth area. That's us. The other 8 aren't. When you're at the board and you're having a vote, we're the Sesame Street song. One of these is not like the others. It's us. So the 8 don't vote the same as us because they're not the same. And the other 6 have their interests and they're busy with their municipalities and they have authorities that are different. The difference in the authority is not a small thing. It's the parking. We don't have the ability to deal with an abandoned vehicle. We get the runaround. You call the police, they say call Modi. Modi says call the RDOS. RDOS says call the police. People call me. How do I know? I can't tell you how many calls I've had from people who told me they're frustrated. They say they get the runaround. That the fire chief tells me his concerns, the frustrations. Our senior staff at the board table say this. They say the problem is the public doesn't understand how difficult and complex it is. And I answer them and I say, that's not the problem. The problem is that attitude. The public who pay the taxes understand just fine. They're reasonable. They want value. They want to get the vehicle towed. It's not that hard. I said, Mayor Vasilaki, Director Vasilaki, he understands how difficult and complex it is to communicate with other levels of government and the police. I said, let's solve the problem. We'll move them out to Headley. Problem solved. I guess the abandoned vehicle will be towed now. That's not the problem. The understanding is not the problem. But the staff are stuck in the normal way they do things. And so how do you make it better? How do you change it? Well, we have a choice. And that's the choice that is before us. You have a choice. Regional district, the system we have, or municipal system, the system we don't have. Are they the same? No, they're not. We've heard over and over they're not the same. The big difference, I'm going to get to four significant benefits. The biggest difference, the most important, is do you want people who are not accountable to you making the decisions for you? That's the question. I'm 5% of the board. You've all seen that. A municipality is 100% of your representation, 100%. You vote for them, you vote for 5% of what you have now. Your municipality will have 100% of the authority on budget. I can't cut things that you might want cut. Doesn't work that way. I can't do it. Municipalities, strangely, can do a better job of financial fiscal responsibility. better value for money, can even lower taxes. So when we look at the differences, 4 big differences: authorities. Municipalities have all the same authorities we have now, and they have much more. Examples: blasting bylaw, parking, subdivision approval authority, difference in enforcement, cannabis and infrastructure, the ability to do things that we can't do now. We just can't do them. Regional district can't do them. Number 2, grants. We've heard it from the consultants, and we'll hear it again next week with the panel discussion. So much more availability in grant money. That's our tax money that goes to Ottawa and Victoria, but it doesn't come here. It goes to Kelowna, it goes to Vancouver. Infrastructure grants, water, sewer, roads. Those are things we don't get that we would get. More democratic accountability, that's the big one. It's easy to understand why people who are not accountable to you may not listen, may not hear, may not even know the issues. I've invited other members of the board to come for a tour of our area. They're not interested. I've asked some staff to come. They're not interested. We've heard members of the community talk likewise. So can you blame them? How much do you know about Tulian? How much do you know about Anarchist? How much do you know about Headley, Coston, or Willowbrook, or Summerland, or Oliver? And so that's who's making your decisions. People who don't live here, people who are not accountable to you. The 4th benefit, big difference, is process is different. At the regional district, we want to do things. I brought forth many notices of motion. It takes years to get those notices through process. Years. Things like cannabis. I've asked for a notice of motion that we bring our zoning on cannabis for review. It's been 2007, October 17, 2018 is when it became legalized. Every local authority was given the opportunity to make their own rules. Penticton makes their own rules. Oliver makes their own rules. Summerland makes their own rules. We can't make our own rules. Our rules are made on a board of 19, some of whom have very different interests. We want to amend that. I've asked, could we just have the same rules as Penticton? It's going to take us 3 to 4 years to get there. I got board support. Let me tell you, it's not easy. We got a moratorium on that. There's other examples. So when we look at the benefits, the differences, these benefits are for everybody in Area D. The benefits of subdivision approval and blasting, environmental safety, all those benefits. I could talk about water and public safety. We don't have time. Anybody, if you're ever interested, you want to talk to me, ask questions, I'll take them always. There's a lot of information. I want to thank everybody very, very much for attending, and thank you for listening to me. I will be available if anybody wants to ask me anything further.
Well, that was for you. Okay. Questions? We're at an open mic for discussion time. People have got questions. I know the consultants do have to leave in the not too distant future. They've got a flight, but we can take a few. All right, we'll take 1 and 2.
First of all, I'd like to thank both parties for informing us. It's been great for us because we've learned so much what's going on. One of the things that wasn't made clear, or I didn't hear it, was the taxes that go to the RDOS from OK Falls. In that process, when we become incorporated, I said when we become incorporated, the taxes do come back to OK Falls so we can look after them. And I hope people understand that we don't get the taxes now. They go to Victoria, RDOS. RDOS gives us something. When we get incorporated, the tax money goes to Victoria and to OK Falls. Then is it right that we send the RDOS something? Thank you, a little bit. But I really thank both of you for giving us this information. And just remember where the taxes are going to go when we get incorporated.
Just wanted to bring something up regarding governance, and Director Obrecht, Rod and I have talked about it a number of times. I sit on two boards within Area D. One is what is known as the Advisory Planning Committee. Deals with zoning, development permits, subdivision, again goes to the province. And the other is I'm chairman of the Parks and Rec Committee. These are both advisory committees. So what happens is the regional district will put forward a zoning amendment. Take for instance the Sun and Sands. Sun and Sands was put forward and basically saying, we want to rezone this. This is what we want to do. We want a variance for height. We want a variance for for parking. We want a variance for for density. So at that point, the committee itself can make a recommendation. That recommendation is in quotes, an advisory recommendation. If we do not like what we are seeing, we could turn down or agree with the regional district. It is looked at, and when it goes to the board can overrule us. So again, it's advisory. So when you're looking at at a committee, the governance then becomes the regional district. They can listen to us. They choose not to listen to us. The same with excuse me. The same with Parks and Recreation. If we're looking at the jumping platform on the bridge, that has been something that I've been dealing with for 2 years.
4 years.
2 years. 2 years for me, and
some of us predate.
Some of us much longer than that. We have made a recommendation. They have said, thank you very much. They looked at the recommendation, and they have said we will get to it. They've gone through various levels of government, and again, it has been postponed this year because it is not, in quotes, a high priority. There are other priorities that take precedence over this. If we're looking at washrooms, they're good at accommodating us with the washrooms, but there are other areas that are considered to be of a higher priority than what we are recommending. So again, it comes down to advising the regional district what we would like to see within our parks, within OK Falls. They can either take our recommendations, table our recommendations, or act on the recommendations. So it is something that governance, if we were incorporated, if we get to that point, mayor and council can then decide, we are going to do this, we are going to do that. And when it comes to grants, excuse my voice, I'm just losing it today. When it comes to grants, I think Director Obrecht and I have we did apply for a grant, and unfortunately, the grant that we applied for wound up in Naramata, if I'm not mistaken, to the tune of $6.9 million. $6.65 million. It's only a few bucks difference. So we applied for it. I'm just shaking right now because I'm so upset about it. It was supposed to be here. If we applied for it as a municipality or town, village, whatever it would be, the money would be here. It would not be up the lake. So when it comes to governance, it's your choice. Do we want mom and dad to look after us and tell us what we're going to do, how we're going to do it? Or, as the previous speaker was talking, sort of feels like Tiny Tim, and he was saying, please, Mr. Scrooge, may I have some more gruel. That's the way I feel.
Tobin, thanks. I'm going to give this to Ron for a second, but I do want to acknowledge Our consultants, I know, have to leave now because we've got Freedom Convoy out on the road again and they still have to get from the phone airport. So I'd like a round of applause for Professor Spencer. I can already see some others leaving. What I'm going to suggest is, Ron, if you want to take a minute to respond to Kelvin's point, then I think we'll close the meeting. Ron and I will still be here for questions if anybody's got a question. And I've checked online, there are no more online questions. So if you've got a question afterwards, please stick around, we're here. So, Ron?
Yes, and thank you. Just on the 6.65 million, I just wanted to clarify for those who don't know, that was in 2016 applied for specific to OK Falls for infrastructure, sewer and or water. At the board, part of the process, it went to sewer expansion to go to Pelini. Pelini had a vote, said no to $6.5 million. I asked for that money to come back to OK Falls. The board did not support me, the staff did not support me. That money went to Naramata. One of the board members, public meeting, for example, said they weren't going to support OK Falls getting the money because OK Falls voted against it. Obviously, they didn't. That detail was lost on some board members. They're busy doing other things. You can understand why. That 6.65 was for OK Falls. It's now going to Naramata. Now I have staff working on other grants that I've asked for to replace that, and we're not going to get 6.65, but maybe we'll get nothing. We'll keep working on it, but it's a great example of how 18 people who don't live here make decisions versus how 5 who did live here. I can't imagine any 5 you voted for would agree with that decision. I can't imagine.
Okay, I'd like to say thank you very much for coming to the meeting today. This is the end, the 5th of our open houses. I want to remind you that there is a really interesting panel session where we've got 4 representatives from other recently incorporated communities that are going to be municipalities that are going to be available to us, their experiences, and also questions and answers. March the 5th, 1 o'clock. If you're in town, we're going to try to get this room booked. Otherwise, though, you'll certainly be able to participate online. So thank you very much for coming. Appreciate your support. Look for the survey. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, Ron and I will still be here.